Dr. Leo Vance was a man who believed in the steadfast march of history, a linear path carved in stone and recorded in ink. As a specialist in antique mechanisms, he saw time as a force to be measured and preserved, each tick of a clock a step forward into a predictable future. But when he is hired to catalog the estate of a reclusive genius, he discovers a single, silent anomaly in a house screaming with the sound of time. This one clock does not tick forward, it ticks back. And Leo, in his quest to understand it, will soon learn the terrifying truth that a life, meticulously built, can also be meticulously unmade. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air in the Finch estate was thick with the dust of forgotten moments and the scent of old wood, brass, and clock oil. For Dr. Leo Vance, it was intoxicating. He stood in the grand foyer, a man of 40, with a mind as meticulously organized as the archives he curated. He had been hired to catalog the entire collection of the late Alistair Finch, a horologist of legendary but reclusive status, before the house and its contents were sold off. For Leo, this wasn't just a job. It was a pilgrimage. His first steps inside were met with a sound that was both overwhelming and strangely symphonic. The ticking of hundreds of clocks. There were grandfathers against the walls, their pendulums swinging in near-perfect heavy rhythm. Cuckoo clocks, momentarily silent, promised chaos on the hour. Ornate mantel clocks rested on every available surface, their delicate tick-tocks forming a higher, lighter counterpoint. It was a cacophony of forward-moving time, a house alive with the relentless beat of 1,000 metallic hearts, all pushing toward the future. It was a sound that should have comforted a man like Leo, a man defined by timelines. Instead, it felt oppressive, a constant, chattering reminder of mortality. He spent the first day making preliminary assessments, moving through rooms cluttered with the magnificent obsession of a single man. Gears, springs, and specialized tools lay on workbenches as if Finch had just stepped away for a cup of tea. It was a beautiful, ordered chaos, and Leo felt a deep professional respect for the man who had built this kingdom of time. On the second day, he entered the main study, and the sound stopped. The silence was so profound, so absolute, that it was more jarring than the noise that preceded it. The study was the heart of the collection, lined with bookshelves and display cases filled with Finch's most prized creations. But here, the constant ticking was gone. A heavy, listening silence hung in the air. In the center of the room, commanding the space, stood the source of this quiet. It was a grandfather clock, nearly 9 feet tall, carved from a dark, lustrous wood that seemed to drink the light. It was a masterpiece of Gothic elegance, with intricate carvings of celestial patterns and spiraling nebulae. But its face was what truly captured Leo's attention. Instead of the familiar Roman or Arabic numerals, there were 12 strange, esoteric symbols, reminiscent of alchemical signs or ancient constellations. Its 3 hands, hour, minute, and second, were crafted from a silvery metal and were perfectly still, frozen at what appeared to be 10 minutes to 2. Leo ran a hand over the polished wood, then he noticed something that sent a shiver of professional curiosity down his spine. The entire room was veiled in a thin layer of dust, the kind that accumulates from years of neglect. Every book, every shelf, every other clock was covered in it. But this one clock, the silent centerpiece, was pristine. There wasn't a single mote of dust on its surface. It was as if it inhabited a different pocket of reality, one where time and its dusty consequences did not apply. He saw it as Finch's magnum opus, the crowning achievement of a lifetime of work. His duty as an archivist, his very nature as a historian of mechanisms, compelled him. He had to know if it worked. He searched the horologist's massive oak desk and, in a small velvet-lined drawer, found a single ornate winding key made of the same silvery metal as the clock's hands. With the reverence of a priest approaching an altar, Leo opened the clock's glass case. The air inside felt strangely cold, a noticeable drop in temperature that he dismissed as a quirk of the sealed environment. He inserted the key into the winding arbor. It turned within a natural smoothness, the gears inside offering no resistance, making no sound. He gave it a full, careful wind, expecting the familiar click of a fully tensioned mainspring, the deep chime of a resurrected giant, or the comforting, heavy tick-tock that would bring it in line with its hundreds of brethren throughout the house. He got none of those things. For a moment, there was only the profound silence. Then, with a motion so smooth it was hypnotic, the second hand began to move. It swept across the arcane face with perfect, silent precision, but it was moving backwards. Tick, 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 counterclockwise. A faint, almost imperceptible draft of cold air emanated from the clock face, chilling the skin on his arms. He stared, baffled. He was a man of logic, of cause and effect, of forward momentum. This was an impossibility, a novelty. It had to be. A brilliantly crafted, eccentric piece of art from a reclusive genius. It was the only explanation that made sense. He closed the glass door, a bemused smile on his face. He had cataloged Finch's masterpiece. Now he could get back to the rest of the collection. He had no idea that the clock had just cataloged him too. Leo left the study, the image of the silently regressing second hand lingering in his mind as a delightful puzzle, a testament to Finch's singular genius. He decided to call the estate agent to schedule a preliminary inventory review. He jotted the number down on a sticky note and placed it by the phone in the hall just an hour ago. He picked up the receiver, his eyes scanning the cluttered table. The note was gone. Annoyed, he patted his pockets. Nothing. He distinctly remembered writing it, the scratch of the ballpoint pen, the exact shade of yellow paper. He sighed, blaming the overwhelming nature of the house. Fatigue, that's all it was. He'd find it in the records and call tomorrow. Later that afternoon, while documenting a series of 18th century French mantel clocks, a pang of thirst reminded him he hadn't had anything to drink since morning. He walked into the kitchen and stopped. On the small breakfast nook table sat a half-finished cup of coffee. Steam was still gently rising from the black liquid. He cautiously touched the ceramic mug. It was warm. He had absolutely no memory of making it, of grinding the beans, of pouring the water. Yet there it was, a tangible artifact from a moment he had apparently lived but not recorded. A cold knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. For a man whose life was a collection of carefully preserved memories, having one go missing was deeply unsettling. The next morning, the feeling of dislocation intensified. The estate agent, a brisk woman named Mrs. Gable, arrived at precisely 9. They stood in the foyer, the cacophony of clocks a jarring backdrop to their conversation. As you can see, Dr. Vance, the collection is immense. We'll need your initial assessment by Friday to present to the auction house. Leo nodded, discussing his process, the need for climate control, and the preliminary timeline. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. He spent the next few hours in the West Wing, losing himself in the intricate workings of a set of planetary clocks. Around noon, he returned to the foyer to retrieve his briefcase. Mrs. Gable was just walking back in through the front door, looking flustered. "Dr. Vance," he said, taking the initiative, "glad you're here. As you can see, the collection is immense. We'll need my initial assessment by Friday to present to the auction house, correct?" Mrs. Gable stared at him, her professionally manicured eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Yes, Dr. Vance. We just discussed this a couple of hours ago. Are you feeling all right?" The blood drained from Leo's face. It wasn't déjà vu, that hazy feeling of repeating a moment. This was different. He remembered the first conversation, but in his mind it hadn't happened yet. He was living it for the first time, while she was experiencing it for the second.
His personal timeline felt as though it had slipped a gear, grinding against the fixed reality of the world around him. He stammered an apology, blaming his preoccupation with the collection, but the look she gave him was one of genuine concern. That evening, as he was washing his hands for dinner, he noticed something that made him freeze. The day before, while prying open a stubborn crate, he had given himself a nasty paper cut on his right index finger. He remembered the sting, the welling of blood, the small bandage he had wrapped around it. He had taken the bandage off that morning, and the thin, red line was still angry and inflamed. Now he held his hand under the light of the bathroom sconce. He turned it over, then over again. The skin was smooth, unbroken, and pale. The cut was gone. Not healed, with the faint silvery trace of a scar. It was completely, utterly gone. There was no trace of it ever having been there. It was an erasure. A quiet, creeping panic began to set in. This was beyond fatigue, beyond a simple slip of the mind. His memory, his conversations, the very cells of his body were being edited. And he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the silent, backward-ticking clock in the study was the author of these revisions.
Logic was the bedrock of Leo's existence. Every action had a reaction. Every effect had a cause. As he stood before the silent clock once more, the cold draft it emitted feeling less like a curiosity and more like a warning, his logical mind desperately sought a rational explanation, and found none. But he could establish a timeline. The memory lapses, the conversation with Mrs. Gable, the vanished cut. These impossible events had all begun at a single specific moment, the moment he had wound this clock. He looked at its face. The hands had moved since he last saw it, silently creeping counterclockwise. They now read 1:15. They were marking the passage of time, just as any other clock, but they were marking the time that had been unmade since he'd wound it. The cold draft wasn't just air. He understood now with a chilling certainty that it was a subtle temporal distortion, the wake of a reality being reversed. The clock wasn't just telling time backwards, it was pulling his time backwards with it. A frantic energy seized him. He turned to Alistair Finch's massive desk, no longer seeing it as an archivist's treasure trove, but as a crime scene. He needed to understand the creator, the motivation behind this monstrous machine. He pulled open drawers, his usual meticulous care replaced with desperate haste. Beneath a stack of complex schematics for a marine chronometer, he found them, a series of thick, leather-bound journals. He opened the first. The script was a precise, elegant cursive, the entries filled with complex physics, esoteric symbols, and horological theory that bordered on the arcane. But as he leafed through the years, the tone began to change. The academic precision was gradually supplanted by a raw, desperate obsession. He found the entry that marked the shift. October 12th. Eleanor is gone. A sudden embolism. The doctor said it was painless, instantaneous. They lied. The pain is infinite and it is all mine. Time, the force I have dedicated my life to measuring, has revealed itself to be a thief. It moved forward and stole her from me. I will not allow it. If time can be measured, it can be controlled. If it can be controlled, it can be reversed. I will build a clock that does not just measure time, but commands it. I will bring her back. Leo's blood ran cold. This wasn't an academic pursuit. It was a resurrection project. He flipped to the final journal, the entries growing more frantic, the handwriting jagged and unstable. Finch had succeeded, but the nature of his success was a horror he had never anticipated. It works. My God, it works. I wound it this morning, but the world did not rewind. The birds did not fly backwards in the sky. My love did not walk back through the door. The effect is localized. It has anchored to me, to the one who gave it power. It is peeling back my existence moment by moment. I made a cup of tea, and then the memory was gone. The cup
empty and cold. I relived yesterday's breakfast. My grief for Eleanor, it feels sharper, newer. The clock is not turning back the world. It is unmaking my timeline. It is erasing me. The entries chronicled Finch's terror as he understood the full scope of his creation. The clock didn't reverse causality for the universe. It anchored to its winder and began a systematic, ruthless process of regression. It unwound the individual, stripping away recent events, then memories, then skills, peeling back the layers of a life like an onion until nothing was left. Finch had created a machine that devoured souls not by magic, but by a terrifying, precise mechanical process. Leo's hand trembled as he read the very last entry, the ink smudged as if by a shaking hand or a tear. The regression is accelerating. I no longer remember the last year of my life with her, only the raw fact of her absence. Soon I will forget her face. Then I will forget the grief that drove me to this. The machine is a monster, and I am its fuel. I see now there was no way to disarm it without causing a paradox that might shatter everything. I cannot stop it. I can only let it unwind me. A final warning to whoever finds this. Do not wind the clock. If you have already done so, do not let it stop. Leo dropped the journal. The words echoed in the silent study, a depth sentence passed down from a ghost. Do not let it stop. What did it mean? A threat? A plea? He looked at the clock, its silver hand sweeping silently backwards, and understood. He was now the fuel. The clock was anchored to him, and it was hungry.
The horror, once a creeping unease, now galloped. Leo woke up in the guest bedroom, the morning light streaming through the window. He felt a sense of purpose, a clarity he hadn't experienced since arriving. He checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. Perfect. Time to get a head start on cataloging the clocks in the main hall. He felt good. It was Wednesday, and he was on schedule. He worked for hours before his phone buzzed. It was his ex-wife, Anya. Her voice was strained. "Leo, are you okay? I was so worried after last night." Leo frowned. "Last night? Anya, I didn't call you last night. I was planning on calling you today, though. How are you?" There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Leo, we had a massive argument. You were talking nonsense, saying you couldn't remember things. You hung up on me. It's Thursday, Leo, not Wednesday." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. He had no memory of the previous day at all. An entire 24-hour block of his existence had been neatly excised, leaving a seamless void. The argument, her worry, the passage of a full day, it had happened to a man who was no longer him. He was a day younger than he was supposed to be, and the world had moved on without him. The phone call with Anya, now colored by her confusion and hurt, felt like a conversation with a stranger about a life he hadn't lived. He tried to apologize, but how do you apologize for an event you have no memory of? His sudden, inexplicable amnesia sounded like a cruel lie. The unraveling bled into his work, the one area of his life that had always been sacrosanct. As an archivist, his greatest pride was the meticulous cross-reference cataloging system he had developed over the past few years. It was his intellectual signature. He sat down at Finch's desk, laid out his tools, opened a new ledger, and froze. He couldn't remember it. The intricate system of codes, the specific sequence of notation, the entire methodology, it was gone. He could remember that he had a system, but the knowledge itself, the skill learned and honed over the last 3 or 4 years, had been unwound from his mind. His professional identity, the very core of his self-worth, was fraying like an old rope. He was left staring at the page, a novice in his own field.
He scrambled for proof of his own existence, a desperate need for a foothold in a crumbling reality. He remembered sending a crucial email to the university's history department just before the argument with Anya he couldn't remember. He booted up his laptop, his fingers fumbling on the keys. He opened his email client and went to the sent folder. It wasn't there. His heart hammered against his ribs. He logged into the university webmail server directly, thinking it was a syncing issue. The email was gone from the server too. It had never been sent. He remembered buying a specific expensive book on horology online, a purchase from the day before yesterday. He logged into his credit card account. He scrolled through the recent transactions. The purchase wasn't there. No record. No charge. The digital and financial footprints of his erased moments were vanishing along with his memories. The clock wasn't just erasing his mind, it was meticulously editing his footprint on reality, snipping the threads that connected him to the world. He was becoming a ghost, and the clock was erasing the evidence that he had ever been there.
The unwinding was no longer measured in days, but in seasons. The clock ticked backward, pulling weeks, then months of Leo's life into its silent temporal vortex. The effect was insidious. He lost memories of major world events he knew he had once discussed. The plots of books he had just read evaporated overnight, and conversations became treacherous minefields of forgotten context. The world was becoming a place of bewildering non sequiturs. One morning, he looked in the bathroom mirror and did not recognize the man staring back. The face was his, but it was younger, less burdened. The fine lines of stress around his eyes, etched there by a recent bitter academic dispute and the slow, painful decay of his marriage, were gone. He looked lighter, happier. He was looking at a version of himself from a year ago, a man who had not yet endured the heartbreaks that were, to the rest of the world, a part of his established past. The stranger in the mirror smiled back, and Leo felt a profound and terrifying disconnect from his own reflection. Anya, her worry having festered into genuine fear after their bizarre phone calls, decided to drive to the estate. She found the front door unlocked and stepped into the deafening chorus of ticking clocks. She called his name, her voice tight with anxiety. "Anya? Darling, what are you doing here?" Leo emerged from the main study, his face breaking into a wide, unguarded smile of pure delight. He crossed the room and pulled her into a warm embrace, kissing her on the cheek. "What a wonderful surprise! I was just thinking about you." Anya froze in his arms, her blood turning to ice. He hadn't called her darling in years. The way he looked at her, the open and uncomplicated affection in his eyes, it was the look he used to give her before the argument started, before the silences grew longer than the conversations, before they had sat down with lawyers and methodically dismantled their life together. He didn't remember their divorce. He didn't remember the last 5 years of pain and separation. He was greeting her with the loving familiarity of a husband who was still very much married. For Anya, this was the most terrifying moment of all. It was one thing to hear about memory loss over the phone. It was another to be confronted by a living, breathing ghost of a man she used to know. He was becoming a relic of his former self, an echo of a happier time that for her was buried under layers of scar tissue. "Leo," she said, her voice trembling as she pulled away, "we need to talk." She guided him to the study, her eyes falling on the silent, magnificent clock in the center of the room. The cold it radiated felt malevolent. While Leo spoke with the bewildered affection of a man catching up with his wife, she saw Finch's journals lying open on the desk. She picked one up and began to read. As Leo described his puzzling but fascinating discovery of the backward ticking clock, Anya read Finch's frantic, terrified warnings. The pieces slammed together in her mind with brutal clarity. The impossible phone calls, his amnesia, his return to a past self, it was all real. It was the clock.
It was unwinding him. She looked from the journal to the man she had once loved, now a stranger inhabiting a familiar body. He was smiling at her, a man from 5 years ago, oblivious to the fact that he was being systematically erased. She understood the horrifying truth. Leo didn't have much time before the clock unwound him past the point of his own core identity, before it took his knowledge, his career, their shared history, everything that made him him. She, the ex-wife he no longer remembered, was his only remaining anchor to the present, and the clock was trying to sever that anchor too.
We have to stop it, Anya said, her voice a raw whisper in the silent study. The journals were spread across the desk, Finch's descent into madness laid bare. Leo, still operating under the blissful ignorance of a man from half a decade ago, looked from the clock to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. To him, the clock was a magnificent novelty. To Anya, it was an executioner. She had to make him understand, painstakingly explaining their divorce, the lost years, the evidence from Finch's own hand. The joy drained from Leo's face, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The man from the past was finally comprehending the nightmare of his present. Their goal was clear, but the path was obscured by Finch's final, cryptic warning. I cannot stop it. I can only let it unwind me. Do not let it stop. What does it mean? Leo asked, his voice shaking. Is it a trap? If we stop the pendulum, will it, I don't know, explode? Lock me in this state forever? The idea of being permanently stranded in his own past, a man with a 5-year memory gap, was a unique and terrifying form of damnation. They had to try. Action was better than passively waiting for his erasure. Together, they approached the clock. Anya reached out her trembling hand and gently touched the gleaming silvery pendulum to still its motion. The result was instantaneously violent. The entire room was racked by a temporal seizure. The light didn't just flicker, it shifted through the spectrum, bathing the room in sickening sepia, then stark black and white, then an oversaturated bleeding color. The air vibrated and the sound of the house's hundreds of other clocks warped into a discordant, grinding shriek that drilled into their skulls. They saw fleeting, ghostly images overlaying their reality. The study filled with Victorian furniture, then suddenly empty and covered in dust sheets, then a flash of Finch himself, hunched over his desk, his face a mask of despair. Anya snatched her hand back as if burned. The room snapped back to normal. The silence returned. The pendulum continued its smooth, backward swing. The clock was protecting itself. It existed within its own set of rules, and brute force was not one of them. They couldn't just break it or halt it. The risk of a catastrophic temporal snap, of reality tearing itself apart around them, was too great. Defeated, they returned to the desk, their hope dwindling. There has to be a way, Anya insisted, her hands sifting through Finch's notes. He built it. There must be a way to unbuild it, or at least disarm it. Leo, his mind now a strange hybrid of past knowledge and present terror, picked up the ornate winding key. It's the only way we've interacted with it safely, he murmured, turning the cool, silvery metal in his hand. The interaction has to be through its own mechanism. The key is the key. They pored over Finch's journals again, this time searching not for warnings, but for a solution. The pages were filled with complex diagrams of escapements and gear trains, esoteric calculations that mixed astrophysics with forbidden geometry. Hidden within the dense text were mentions of a mainspring release and a temporal governor, but the instructions were not straightforward. They were cryptic, couched in riddles and paradoxes. To halt the recession, one must not cease the motion, but reverse the intention at the point of origin. Anya read aloud. What does that even mean? The point of origin, the winding, Leo theorized, his mind beginning to spark with its old analytical fire. It's not about stopping the clock. It's about safely unwinding the power we put into it. But the method, it's hidden here, in these diagrams. It's a puzzle, and we're running out of time to solve it. He looked at the clock, its hands marching backwards, relentlessly erasing the very man who was trying to save himself. The clock accelerated its feast. It was no longer consuming days or months, but years. The regression was now a torrent, and Leo was drowning in it. His vocabulary began to simplify, complex thoughts unspooled into basic concepts. He would stare at a page from Finch's journals, the intricate physics he could have deciphered a week ago now looking like meaningless squiggles. He was losing the very intellect Anya needed to help her solve the final riddle. He would have moments of lucidity, the terrified man of the present breaking through, only to be submerged again by a younger, more naive version of himself. He was becoming a passenger in his own devolution. As the clock's backward sweep intensified, a strange resonance began to build within the room. It was as if the machine, in unwinding Leo's past, was disturbing the house's own memories, stirring the residual psychic energy left behind by its creator. The air grew thick, shimmering at the edges of their vision. Then it happened. The room dissolved around them, not in a violent distortion, but in a ghostly replay. The clock projected a powerful, coherent memory from Alistair Finch. Leo and Anya stood like invisible spectators in the same study years in the past. They saw a younger Finch, vibrant and happy, working at his desk. They saw his wife, Eleanor, a woman with a warm smile, enter the room carrying a tea service. They witnessed the tragic, simple accident, a misstep on the rug, a fall, the sharp, sickening crack as her head struck the corner of the heavy oak desk. They were forced to watch Finch's world shatter, to see his love die in his arms in that very room. His cry of despair was a silent scream that echoed in their souls. They saw his motivation not as a scientific curiosity, but as an agony so profound he would break the laws of physics to undo it. In that terrible, ghostly vision, Anya saw it. As the spectral Finch knelt beside his wife, his body shaking with grief, he clutched the silver key in his hand. In a spasm of rage and despair, he made a motion with it, a specific, sharp, counterintuitive twist in the air, a gesture of wanting to turn back the very second that had just passed. The riddle wasn't in the journals. It was never in the journals. It was an emotional reflex, a memory of pain impressed upon the house itself. Anya's mind raced, connecting the vision to the cryptic text. Reverse the intention at the point of origin. It wasn't a mechanical instruction, it was an emotional one. And Finch's final warning, do not let it stop, suddenly became clear. It didn't mean don't ever stop the clock. It meant don't let it run its full course and unwind you back to the void of non-existence. You had to intervene. Leo, the key! She yelled, snapping them both back to their present reality. She grabbed the silver key from the desk. The clock's hands were sweeping backwards at a dizzying pace, erasing years with every pass. She had to perform the maneuver, the specific and difficult counter-turn she had witnessed in the vision. But she had to do it at the exact right moment, the moment the hands crossed the point of the clock's initial winding. Fighting against the temporal storm that now raged around the clock, the air thick and resistant like water, she plunged the key into the winding arbor. Lights flared, sounds warped, and the ghostly image of Finch's grief flickered around her.
It was a tense, delicate mechanical operation in the heart of a psychic hurricane. With a cry of exertion, she performed the twist, reversing the intention. There was a final, great thump from deep within the clock's mechanism, a sound so profound it felt like a heartbeat and a death rattle all at once. The frantic backward ticking stopped. The silver hands froze, hovering over the arcane symbols. The oppressive cold that had filled the study for days vanished, replaced by the neutral, dusty air of the old house. For a long, breathless moment, there was only a profound silence. Then, a new sound. Tick. Tock. Slow, steady, and forwards. The great machine began to keep time as it was meant to, its heavy pendulum swinging in a comforting, grounding rhythm. The temporal anomaly had been stabilized. The monster was now just a clock. The release of psychic tension was immense. Leo collapsed to the floor, the regression halting with a jolt that shuddered through his entire being. But the damage was done. He was saved, but he was fractured. He looked up at Anya, his eyes filled with a terrifying vacancy. The last 10 years of his life were gone. Not just forgotten, but experienced as a chaotic, condensed story told to him by a woman he was only just beginning to remember he had divorced. His memory was a ruin, a collection of facts without feelings, a history he would have to relearn, a life he would have to inhabit like a stranger. He was a man out of time in his own life. They didn't know what to do with the clock. Destroying it felt like a desecration, and worse, a risk. Letting anyone else find it was unthinkable. So they became its new custodians. They informed the estate agent that cataloging the vast collection would take years, an indefinite project. They became the secret keepers of the Finch estate, protecting the world from the dangerous, beautiful machine in the study. Months later, a fragile new normal had taken root. The hundreds of other clocks had been carefully packed and sold, their cacophony silenced. Only the one great clock remained, its steady, forward-ticking, a constant, comforting presence, a sound of healing. Leo was slowly, painstakingly rebuilding himself. With Anya's patient help, he was relearning his own story, piecing together the man he had become in the years the clock had stolen. Their relationship was new, different, forged not in romance, but in a shared impossible trauma. They were two people bound by a secret that no one else in the world could ever understand. One evening, Leo stood before the clock. The forward ticking was the soundtrack to his recovery. He looked at his reflection in the polished glass of its case, seeing the face of the man he was now. A little older, a little more tired, but present. Then for a split second, the reflection flickered. In the glass, he saw the younger, happier man he had been 10 years ago, smiling back at him with an innocence he could no longer claim. He blinked, and his current fractured reflection returned. The ghost in the machine had shown him the ghost within himself. He reached out and placed a hand on the clock's warm, dark wood. It was a silent acknowledgement of all he had lost, of the man he used to be, and the uncertain future he now had to build, one forward tick at a time.